So being an antinatalist, you tend to pick up on things that people say just in society generally around having kids and procreation, which is kind of twisted and backwards, but also stuff that just doesn't make any sense, even not from an antinatalist perspective. Even the average person, I think, would be able to see the ridiculousness of it if it was pointed out to them. But because we're antinatalists, we pick up on it. So in this video, I'm going to go over 4 key ones that I've picked up on, which I think just make no sense. And I'm sure other people will have picked up on ones that I'm not going to include in this video. Comment them below. So number 1 is actually a bit of an obscure one in that you will only really hear it in certain circumstances. And it's odd because the process that it's relevant to, I've actually been through, but it didn't really click in my head how weird the standards are that people hold for this. So it's when you're going through the process of getting sterilized, either a vasectomy or a tubal ligation or another form of sterilization, you will be asked certain questions. Now, a lot of those questions are to check whether you're being coerced into this decision or something like that. But some of them are to check if you are of sound mind or if you have any sort of conditions, whether they be psychological or physical, that would mean that you're not suitable to get a vasectomy or another sterilization. Now, there's something really weird about this, and I didn't pick up on it at the time. I went through this process. I got asked these questions. The weirdness of this was brought to my attention when a friend sent me this video, which I'm going to include now.
A friend of mine just got a vasectomy, which we're pumped for. But the crazy part is, like, because he doesn't have kids, before they let him have the vasectomy, he had to get a psychological evaluation, right? Which is just like a crazy policy to me, because, like, what happens if he fails that test? Are they just like, sorry, dude, you're crazy. You have to have kids. Like, get out there and make some maniacs, you lunatic. Why is that?
So before I go into this, I do think there should obviously be some checks and balances in the way of people seeking sterilization. Now, not cumbersome or oppressive forms, but sterilization isn't the form of contraception for everyone. So there should be some sort of process people have to go through to be able to find out if it's right for them. Anyway, having made that clarification, so what this guy points out is that it just seems like such a weird message to be sending people. And I didn't fully pick up on it until I saw this video clip of this guy. Now, obviously, what people may say is that, okay, well, actually, they're just checking if sterilization is the right avenue for you. And maybe they would be against you getting sterilized, but they would still encourage you to use other forms of contraception. But a lot of other forms of contraception are riskier than sterilization. And so if someone is not like stable enough or whatever to be able to make a decision about getting sterilized, should we be encouraging them to go down these other avenues where if they're less stable, they're probably more likely to use contraception wrong and end up accidentally or intentionally having a child? And again, if they're not fit enough to have had the sterilization, why would we assume they're fit enough to raise a whole human being? It's the same sort of thing with adoption, you know, so there's a lot of process that people have to go to make sure that it's going to be a safe environment and they are the right sort of people to raise someone. And that's a good thing because we don't want people to get adopted into environments where actually they're going to be worse off and maybe abused in some way. So that's the correct thing to do. But it's weird that we live in a world where if people are doing the more responsible thing, which I think is adopting, they go through all this rigor, which is good. But on the other hand, you have people doing the less responsible thing, which is just creating someone to suffer out of nothing. And they literally don't even have to have any sort of qualification for that. Now, the reason that we live in this sort of world, obviously, is because it would be very unethical to go around and control people's reproductive systems. And so we can't really put these barriers in people's way to exercise their bodily autonomy, which is essentially what people are doing when they procreate. Now, obviously, I think that is a huge miscarriage of using your bodily autonomy, but going down the road of controlling people's bodily autonomy in that way, especially around reproduction, has a dark history and it would have a dark future if people chose to pursue that again. Okay, so the second one that I've noticed is that it's quite common for ordinary people to say that they would not have a kid if they found out through some genetic screening or something that their kid would have some sort of genetic abnormality or disability or something like this that is going to make their life, as they see it, unduly burdensome. But this to me makes no sense because these people are recognizing that by creating someone, you can be putting a burden on them. They just don't see normal life as a burden because I think they suffer from status quo bias. What these people don't recognize is that, sure, it's bad to create people who have burdensome disabilities, but the capacity for suffering itself is a burdensome characteristic to impose on someone. And so it's just baffling to me that people have specific issues with specific disabilities from coming into existence, but they have no issue with suffering generally coming into existence. And another thing that makes even less sense is that someone born with a disability, let's take for example Down syndrome, could actually have a better life than someone who was born with no condition that we would generally consider a disability, but that person could have a way worse life than that person with Down syndrome merely because they have the capacity to suffer and they've been in worse circumstances than that person who has Down syndrome, who also has the capacity to suffer, but maybe just given their life circumstances, their life hasn't been as bad. So this seems to me like a massive double standard, and it's just people looking at specific scenarios and saying, oh yeah, well, you know, I'm this virtuous person because I would not put that on someone, but this thing over here that could potentially be worse and is very bad anyway, fuck it, I'll do that. Number 3 is about a saying that we at least have in English, but I assume this is a very general saying that I think it probably is in a lot of languages and cultures. So in English, we have a saying, life isn't fair. This is very commonly used throughout society, and it's usually used when someone is complaining about some sort of grievance that they've gone through, usually through no fault of their own. And so they go to someone and they talk about this grievance that they've got, and often people will say that life isn't fair. And they can say it in 2 ways. They can say it in one way to sort of recognize the trauma that someone has gone through and say, look, that is really shit, but one of the reasons it's happened is that life just isn't fair, which is true. And there's another way that people can say it, which is dismissive, where, you know, if someone comes to you and presents some sort of grievance and you say, oh, well, life isn't fair, which I think is a bit of a callous way to approach it, especially if it's a parent saying it to a child, because they're the one that put them in that situation. But it's just odd because we're so used to saying this thing, life isn't fair, which is very true. It isn't. In a multitude of ways, it isn't fair. But the very people that say it don't realize that they are the ones perpetuating putting people in this situation. If life isn't fair, why are you putting people in unfair situations? In basically any other context that I can think of, people would say, no, if I don't have to, I wouldn't put someone in an unfair situation because that would be unfair. It would maybe be, I'd maybe go as far as to say it's unethical. But when it comes to procreation and creating a life, people are so blinded by the emotional attachment that they have to life and creating a new life, and the sense of entitlement that they feel they're entitled to create someone else, that I think people are blinded and they feel that they are entitled to impose this unfair situation on someone else completely without their consent. They had no interest in coming here, but this person imposed this unfair situation on someone else merely because they wanted to. And the fourth thing, and I think this is personally the one that actually irritates me the most, is about an avoidance of responsibility. Now, it's a bit nuanced, this one. So obviously when one or two people create someone else, they clearly recognize that they have a responsibility to that person. But there are two types of responsibility, right? So you obviously have a responsibility to that person in terms of having certain obligations to them. So if you create a child, you need to provide that child with food, nurture them, all of this sort of stuff. There's another form of responsibility, which is responsibility for consequences. So I'll pop up a clip now of Glynos talking about what I mean by the responsibility for consequences.
If you have a child, knowing that there is a 1 in 3 chance that that kid will have cancer, that you are responsible for that kid if it gets cancer, because you have the choice, have a child or not having a child, knowing the risk. So if you have a child and that kid gets cancer, that is your mess. That is your responsibility. And
it's this form of responsibility that I think is the key thing here, and the thing that is so maddening. So obviously, in terms of responsibility, when it comes to having responsibility to meet the person's needs, I think the vast majority of parents do generally take that on board. There are some scumbags out there who create a child and just have no concern for that child. But this form of responsibility, I think, is far, far less commonly recognized by people who procreate. I think the things that children and people generally go through and can go through. Imagine someone who was born and they have some sort of medical condition that they have for the rest of their life. Or maybe they develop cancer very early on in life. Or maybe they develop cancer later on in life. Or maybe they get Parkinson's or dementia or a whole plethora of things. Or maybe an accident happens to them. Now, when this happens, often, not all the time, there are some people who do recognize this form of responsibility, but often it's seen as, oh, well, that's just part of life. You know, it wasn't necessarily me that is responsible for this because, you know, I'm entitled to create this person. This is just something that is owed to me. I just did the thing that is owed to me, and it sucks for them. And I'm also sad for them, but it sucks for them, but I'm not responsible. It sucks for them that this stuff has happened to them. But I don't think often, and I haven't observed this in society, that people fully recognize that if you create someone and you're fully aware of all the bad things that can happen to them, like, sure, people don't list out all of the bad things that can happen to their child, although I think that would be a valuable exercise and it would make people think more, but people don't do that, right? So they maybe don't have it at the forefront of their consciousness, but people do know that when they create someone, in the back of their mind, they do know that by doing that, they're creating someone who awful things can happen to, things that they wouldn't want to go through, but they're putting someone else in a position where they could go through it. And I think if people fully recognize that, then they would realize, oh, okay, well, if I've created someone and I know these things can happen to them, and then I do create them and they do happen to them, well, I'm the one who had control over that. And so I'm therefore responsible for the consequences, even if there's some other agent involved. So say you create someone and then later in life they're abused by a priest or they're killed by a murderer or something like that. Sure, that person who did the bad thing also has responsibility, but responsibility there is also in the hands of the person who originally procreated, because they set off and set up the initial set of actions and initial set of conditions that even made that possible when they literally didn't even have to. That person had no interest at all in coming into existence. But anyway, let me know what you thought of those 4 ones. Put in the comments if you have seen these when interacting with other people, and if you've seen any more as well, these sort of backwards twisted double standards that you see people making that I haven't included in this. And I will see you in the next one.